Good evening, I'm Mike Knetter. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the UW Now Livestream series, where we bring you experts from the UW community to talk about various aspects of the COVID-19 crisis. And we've got a great lineup tonight on a very timely topic. Before we get to that, as many of you know, today is Giving Tuesday, and there are many pressing needs in society. And certainly we have our own here at the University of Wisconsin. And our effort is to address some critical opportunities such as testing, treatment, and vaccine efforts related to COVID-19, and many of the challenges resulting from the economic impacts of the pandemic. So if you're able to, we would appreciate your help. And if you can't help UW, maybe there's another cause out there for you, but Giving Tuesday is a great opportunity to take part. Tonight's show features 3 outstanding faculty members who are working at the local, state, and national level on planning the deployment of COVID-19 vaccines. They are true exemplars of the Wisconsin idea, and it's a very important topic, and we're all quite interested. I know I am at my advanced age. So joining me this evening are Alta Charo, a legal expert who's serving on the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine Committee that has developed a framework to advise the CDC and other agencies on the equitable allocation of COVID-19 vaccines. James Conway is the medical director of the UW Health Immunization Program and a pediatrician who studies infectious diseases and worldwide immunization programs. And Jonathan Temte, a community health leader who is serving on the COVID-19 vaccine work group of the U.S. Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices and on the State Disaster Medical Advisory Committee to help the Wisconsin Department of Health Services respond to COVID-19. So our 3 guests tonight are really involved at the highest level in some of the most pressing issues facing the country in this public health crisis. And I just want to say thank you to all of you for making time to join us tonight.
Happy to.
First up this evening, we will have Professor James Conway, a pediatric infectious disease specialist. He's the Associate Director of the UW's Global Health Institute, the Medical Director of the UW Health Immunization Program, and the Director of the Office of Global Health at the School of Medicine and Public Health. He's a Fellow of the American Academy of Pediatrics, AAP, serving in the sections on infectious diseases and international child health, and he's received an AAP Special Achievement Award in 2008 for his immunization projects. He's also a member of the board of directors of the Wisconsin AAP chapter, where he serves as chair of the Committee on Immunizations and Infectious Diseases. So I guess the world came to you, Professor Conway, because we sure need what you've been studying. So please enlighten us.
Happy to be here, Mike. Thanks for the opportunity, and thanks for joining us, everyone. Chris, can you pull up the slides? Thank you. So I'm going to just try to give a little background on this whole process of trying to develop vaccines for this COVID-19 pandemic in the midst of a pandemic. Next slide. You know, it's been amazing that within a year, we went from having first discovered this virus and having it sequenced within a few weeks of its discovery to already at the threshold of actually being able to deliver vaccines. And if you think about the usual process of vaccines taking as long as 8 to 10 years, it's been really a remarkable year. Next slide. And we've really figured out a lot about this virus. This is kind of a schematic of what these things look like, but most of what we've determined is the ideal opportunity for developing immunity for humans is based on this spike glycoprotein, these pink things that are sort of projecting here, which seem to be quite stable and really do present in the immune system a really robust immune response. Next slide. So when we think about developing vaccines, we basically think about 2 things. Are they safe and do they work? From a do they work side, it's called efficacy. And basically the idea is, can we develop and produce the immune protection needed to prevent future infections? The idea is essentially tricking the immune system to think it's had something before. The idea for an ideal vaccine candidate is going to be long-lasting immunity that is easily boosted either by exposure or future doses of the vaccine. And if an infection does occur, at least that it's a mild infection and is not severe, and ideally prevents shedding and transmission to other people and activates both parts of the immune system that are important for protection, B cells to make antibodies and T cells to have cellular memory immunity. From a safety standpoint, while we think about the acute short-term side effects. We also have to worry about long-term side effects, which usually show up within a couple of months in most vaccines. And then most importantly for this disease, does there actually result in any enhanced immune response when an infection occurs? In other words, if you are pre-vaccinated and you get the disease, is your immune response just fight off the disease, or does it overdo it? And as we know from this current pandemic, this virus in particular seems to be very capable of stimulating and really knocking the immune system sideways. So that's one of the major concerns from a safety standpoint. We have got lots of experience developing vaccines across the entire globe, and this is just an example of what the different types of vaccines. We've got some vaccines that are the whole pathogen, some that are just pieces of these things, and then there have been these future ideas of developing things like DNA or RNA to actually be the source of the antigen. These all have been used in the past for various vaccines, and some of these ones on the bottom, which we considered sort of futuristic, have also come to bear to be useful tools now as we move into having vaccines available. Next. So what are the things that have kept me awake throughout this pandemic thinking about a vaccine? Well, one of the things we have to recognize is that coronaviruses are actually quite common. About 5 to 15% of colds every winter are caused by coronaviruses. And unfortunately, although people develop antibodies against those, reinfections do occur. Next is that we actually don't really know what the surrogate marker of immunity from COVID-19 is. In other words, we don't know that you can give a vaccine and then test a particular antibody and say that that actually protects you against the disease. And so we've actually had to figure out that the only way to really prove that these things are protective is by giving them to people and then releasing those people into the wild where the virus is circulating to see if it protects them. The best target antigen currently seems to be that pink spike glycoprotein, but is that the best antigen? And what happens if these things start to mutate? Do we have to start updating these vaccines the way we do with flu vaccines every year? And then what's the best way to give these? Is an intramuscular injection really the best idea? Or would these be better delivered through the intranasal route or in through the skin? And then of course the challenge of all of this being so political has just made things that much more complicated. Next. As I mentioned, the other challenge is one of the things we worry about is could there be enhanced disease after the vaccine? I think some people have heard of this MIS-C disease, which happens particularly in children after they recover from coronavirus disease, that some weeks later they sometimes develop this systemic inflammatory disease that has similarities to something called Kawasaki disease. So one of the things everybody wants to make sure we're careful about is that vaccine does not prime the immune system so that when the virus shows up later, that person's immune system doesn't go into this spiral and cause this MIS-C disease. How long does the immunity last, and are we going to need boosters? Time will tell. But we know that reinfections do occur after SARS-CoV-2 infections, and these seem to be more common after people have asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic infections. So perhaps we're going to need to give subsequent doses of vaccine to keep maintaining that immunity. When we test vaccines, we usually test them in healthy young people initially, but the target population for this disease is clearly older individuals who have other medical conditions called comorbidities. And so we've had to actually change the process a little bit and make sure we integrate some of those populations early in the process to make sure that we're really capturing the most accurate data for these vaccines. And then obviously we're going to talk about how we improve the progressive process of approving these vaccines, how we mass manufacture them, and then how do we target and equitably distribute these and deal with this cold chain, ultra cold chain concern that has been raised. So those are the things that keep me awake. What allows me to sleep pretty well at night? Well, this has been an unprecedented global effort to develop a vaccine or develop multiple vaccines. We've seen collaboration between companies, collaborations between countries, and this widespread sharing of information. People really willing to give up what their scientific discoveries are for the betterment of others. And so all of these preprint manuscripts that are commonly available. There are lots of potential candidate vaccines, I'll show you in a second. And then there's both proven and then these novel technologies that are brought to bear. Lots of money being put into the research and development. There's some element of an international competition, which is really driving investment then from other countries as well. A lot of novel approaches to the research and development process, and the fact that we've actually had prior outbreaks with other coronavirus, including MERS and SARS-CoV-1, that both died out on their own, but actually gave us a lot of information. And there was certainly some vaccine development efforts that happened in 2002 and 2009 and 2012 along with those. And so we do have some experience. And then as I mentioned, the other thing is that at least currently, these viruses seem to be quite stable. Next. As I mentioned, this has really been a worldwide effort, and though most of the news we see here in the United States is focused on what happens here in our own backyard, I think it's encouraging to notice that there's really work going on around the globe in trying to come up with vaccines, not only that are available in our country, but we really need to think about how do we actually immunize the entire planet. Next. So briefly, when vaccines are developed, in the preclinical phase is when they're in a laboratory and being tested on animals. They go into limited numbers of people in phase 1 to see what the right dose is. And as they move into phase 2, then trying to see, do they actually create the immunity that we desire or we think we desire? And how are the side effects? And then they move into phase 3, where it's real world testing, where we see how they perform in large numbers of people, literally tens of thousands of people. So, when we talk about vaccines, we talk about the fact that, for every vaccine that we use, probably 99 other ones were at least considered and then dropped along the way. So about 1 in 100 vaccines makes it to market. So currently we've got 48 different vaccines that are at various stages of these clinical trials, including a fair number in phase 1 and phase 2, and then 11 candidates in phase 3, of which 2 were rapidly approved in Russia and 4 already approved in China for use, at least in limited fashion, in some of their population. Next slide. And in that preclinical phase, sort of the upstream version, there are 164 when I checked the other day at the World Health Organization. They maintain this public draft landscape where you can actually see what vaccines are being registered for testing. And you can see on the left here a long list of all the different types of vaccines that are being tested in various forms in labs. And really, I think that there's not only a winner, there's probably multiple winners in here that will eventually help us get out of this pandemic. Next slide. I want to briefly talk about this concept of Operation Warp Speed that has gotten so much press, just so people understand that this is really a US-based program and how it's worked. So initially, the government chose 14 promising candidates from, at that time, almost 100 candidates, now almost 200, winnowed it down to about 8 or 10 that they started small clinical trials, and then 3 to 5 of those have been gradually moving into larger and larger trials. The FDA also has streamlined the process for reviewing things as they move through this process, because in all honesty, this 8 to 10 years that vaccines typically took really was not particularly necessary. And I think it was really ripe for some improvements and efficiency. But in addition to sort of underwriting and sort of encouraging a lot of the clinical development, Operation Warp Speed has also provided funding to actually start to ramp up manufacturing and distribution early, and much earlier than most companies would be willing to invest, so that once these things are actually tested and tried and true, there's already going to be vaccine available and ready for shipping. Next. And as my colleagues are going to talk about, there's also been a lot of discussion already happening in addition to developing the infrastructure and developing the materials like cold chain storage and glass vials and other things to make this possible. A lot of discussion at multiple levels about exactly how do we roll these out ethically and fairly, initially, at least when there's only limited supplies. And so then on to the state level, where then each state is going to be responsible for implementing. And we'll talk more about that as the evening winds on. Next slide. This is just a brief schematic to sort of give you some comparison to the top, which is kind of the usual paradigm for how vaccines get developed, where they spend years kind of marching through each of these phases. And you can see on the right-hand side here, this large-scale manufacturing only happens after the vaccine is tried and true and licensed, and then the companies get around to actually being willing to ramp up and make lots of it. What Operation Warp Speed really did is basically stack these things up and remove some of the financial risk to the companies so that they could focus on this light blue clinical development, while at the same time, with some government funding support, they could also be ramping up manufacturing development and be able to turn on this large-scale manufacturing quite quickly. Next. So here's the 10 vaccines that basically ended up being the Operation Warp Speed choices. The top 2 are the 2 mRNA vaccines that you've been hearing so much about from Moderna and Pfizer. Each of those tested in 30 to 40,000 people, both of them requiring 2 doses for all the recipients. And then the next 2 that will be coming sometime in 2021 likely will be the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine and the Johnson & Johnson vaccines, both of which use an adenovirus-based vector as a way of delivering the pieces of the COVID-19 virus that we want to present to the immune system. Next slide. Now, what are the challenges as we move ahead? Uh-oh, we're stuck. There we go. Next slide. So one was the concern about the politics of all of this and concerns at the pharma level that they were being pushed to rush things. And I thought it was very heartening back in September that all of the leaders of the major manufacturers of these vaccines got together and basically insisted that they would continue to honor their historic pledge to continue to work through the scientific process without cutting any corners. That while everybody was on board with trying to speed things up and make them more efficient, that this really could not be a cutting of corners process to get these vaccines to our needed populations. Next. The other challenge, as I mentioned, was the cold chain issue. And you can see the Pfizer vaccine on the bottom here. And while everybody's been making a big deal about this low temperature required for storage and shipping, I like to share with people that that's basically the same temperatures that your ice cream and your frozen steaks arrive. And so that's the reason that the CDC and others have been telling people it's really not necessary to buy up large quantities of ultra cold freezers, that there really are methods to manage this. More importantly, if you look at the top of this, AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson, and Moderna's vaccines are basically maintained at the same temperatures that we maintain a lot of other vaccines. So this cold chain thing, I think, is really not as concerning as people would make it out to be. Next. However, in the rest of the world, and putting on my global health hat, we do have to acknowledge that that type of freezer capacity and those kind of cold chains are not present and available in all parts of the world. And so ultimately, vaccine development will need to include vaccines that are stable at other temperatures. And fortunately, a lot of these other candidate vaccines do fit that profile. Next. And lastly, obviously, the rising problems with vaccine hesitancy worldwide about all vaccines, but bad enough that in 2019, WHO actually added vaccine hesitancy as one of the top 10 health threats to our planet. Next slide. And we've seen this across the country, even back in June, before there were even vaccines really much in the way of clinical trials, 50% of Americans basically saying they would not accept a vaccine. I think as we've seen more encouraging news, that has been starting to shift. But even this week, the Gallup polls only show about 58% of individuals believe that they would accept a vaccine. So even with all of this science and development process that's been happening, we still have to recognize that the public has a stake in this and really needs to understand the process as well as the checks and balances to really be confident that they are willing to embark on this process with us. So I'll finish up there and turn it over to my colleagues.
Great. Well, thank you for setting the stage for us tonight, Professor Conway. That was a great tour through all of the outstanding issues here. Next up, we've got Professor Alta Charo. She is the Warren Knowles Professor of Law and Bioethics at UW-Madison School of Law. She's an elected fellow of the National Academy of Medicine, where she serves on its board on health sciences policy and its executive council. Professor Charo's public service includes the Obama-Biden Transition Health and Human Services Review Team, Senior Policy Advisor in the Office of the Commissioner at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, as well as several expert advisory boards of organizations with an interest in stem cell research. She's also the co-chair of the National Academy of Medicine Forum on Regenerative Medicine and the Committee on Human Gene Editing. That's not the normal profile of a law professor, and we are delighted to have Professor Charo at UW-Madison and look forward to your remarks.
Thanks very much. That's very kind. I want to spend just a few moments talking about what's going to happen when we try to figure out how to distribute the vaccines that are finally coming on the market. And as we all know, they're coming on in sequence. We've just heard only 2 are about to go through an approval process and 2 more behind that, but then there's going to be yet others. So in the beginning, there will not be enough for everybody. And the question is, who gets it and who gets it first and who gets which one? So if you can throw up the first slide for me, please. One of the first questions you have to ask is, what would we think of as being a fair way to handle this problem of scarcity? There's any number of ways you could try to do that. Each one has its own version of fairness, whether it's about focusing on the needs of vulnerable people or it's about trying to make a more functional society. or it's trying to slow the transmission of the pandemic. So, for example, lotteries may seem very fair because they're completely random, but they may not give you your biggest bang for the buck. It may not help save the most lives. It may not slow the pandemic the most. If you want to try to slow the pandemic, what you're going to try to look for are people who have a high risk of exposure and a high risk of transmitting then through their jobs. This often will be people who are in service work. They can't, like some of us, sit at home and lecture remotely through Zoom, but they have to be out there. Caregivers with personal hands-on work with patients are an example of people who have a high risk of exposure. But perhaps they're healthy. So even if they're exposed and infected, they may not get all that sick. So maybe you want to focus on trying to reduce the number of people who actually die from this thing. Well, then you're going to be looking at people who actually are all set up to die. They've got underlying diseases like diabetes, or they are on the elderly side, over 70 years old, for example, or have other kinds of medical vulnerabilities. Of course, maybe your first thought is that you think the fair thing to do is make sure that the rest of us can live long enough to get the vaccine. So we need to make sure that we keep the healthcare system running. So you're going to focus first on making sure that healthcare workers not only don't get infected and get sick, but don't get so scared they're going to get infected and sick that they stop coming to work. After all, most of them go home to families with children and elderly parents and are worried about bringing something back and harming their families. You could also talk about trying to keep the most essential services running. We've all come to recognize that food services along the entire food supply chain are absolutely essential. Society can't run if we don't have food flowing. This is why we had the meat packers continuing to work in the spring, even when things were shutting down. But what constitutes an essential service? That can be a hyper-local question. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised here in Wisconsin as we go into the cold months that snowplow operators are essential because if you don't clear the snow from the streets, the ambulance can't get through. But in the summertime, it might be air conditioning repair people in Arizona because there people die from heat stroke. So what it is that you need to keep society running is going to be a matter of a judgment call. And should we maybe preference that to keep things running, keep schools open, keep businesses going as much as possible? There are those who've said, no, the fair thing to do is to try to get the biggest bang for the buck, in which case we're going to try to vaccinate the people who are at the younger end, because for every one of them that doesn't get sick and die, we've gained 70, 80 years of life. Whereas if you will focus on the elderly, maybe you get an extra 5 years before that person would have died from some other cause. And then last, we really need to ask, well, what about maybe dealing with people who already suffer tremendous inequities? We've seen in this pandemic one of the most vivid examples ever of how it is that in our society, structural poverty and racism issues have affected which groups get sick more often, and when they get sick, get sicker and die more frequently. It can be because they live in higher density housing, apartments instead of houses, more crowded. It may be because they tend to be in service jobs instead of professional white-collar jobs that can be done remotely by computer. Can be that they've had poor or no health insurance coverage earlier in life and so now have more comorbidities. But we've now seen in the African American, Hispanic communities, and then particularly in the Native American and Alaskan Native communities, tremendously disproportionate levels of infection, serious illness, and death. So another way to say we can be fair is to try to correct that before we worry about anything else. The challenge here is to identify our goals and then match the goals to the particular priorities that are going to make the most sense to achieve them. If we move to the next slide, you'll see that in the advice that our committee at the National Academy gave to the CDC and to the NIH, which will then be part of the many forms of guidance that the CDC will be using, and you'll be hearing from Dr. Temte about that, we had said we probably need to be talking about phases, and that in the first phase, it may make most sense to just jumpstart things with healthcare workers so that we can at least keep our healthcare system functioning. And then very quickly, as soon as we have enough, begin to move on to people who are significantly higher risk of getting severely ill or dying from the disease. Those are the people who get hospitalized, and we're already seeing our hospitals burdened now to the point of being unable to accept many more patients before they are hit capacity. And then particularly for people who are older or have comorbidities, the ones that are living in these congregate settings like nursing homes, where you have people often that are elderly, have multiple diseases, and where because of the level of density and because of the fact that caregivers go from patient to patient, it's incredibly hard to avoid transmitting the virus. And indeed, in nursing homes, we have seen a way disproportionate number of deaths as compared to the rest of the population. It's only after that that we had recommended that you move on to other populations, including critical industries and the workers in them, people who are at moderately high risk as opposed to severely high risk, the whole host of other people who are situationally vulnerable through things like homeless shelters, prisons, as well as beginning to focus now on teachers so that we can get our schools functioning. This means that for people who are basically healthy in their middle years, or are working in industries that are somewhat peripheral, the world can live without them, at least temporarily, it may take longer to get to the point where they can get vaccinated, and they will need to continue protecting themselves as opposed to using the vaccine. And keeping in mind that everybody is going to continue to need to use social distancing and masking for a long time. Cross-cutting all of this, it was our view that at every one of these phases, you need to pay attention to the equity issue and the disproportionate effect on minorities and the poor. And to that extent, if you don't have enough vaccine within any particular phase, we said, take a look at the social vulnerability index that the CDC has created, which looks geographically for concentrations of people who often have multiple factors. They are poor, living in dense housing, and they tend to have a lot of comorbidities, and they tend to be working in jobs where they can't avoid exposures. And focus your attention there before you move on to everybody else in the phase. And in that sense, try to meet multiple goals at once of keeping essential functions running for society and also dealing with the most vulnerable. But I need to emphasize this is only one of many different sources of advice that's being given to the federal government, and then from the federal government, advice that will then flow down to the states. And if you move to the last slide, I will just give that a heads up. But after Dr. Temte describes to you what goes on at the CDC's level, having taken in advice from academicians, from the NAM, et cetera, there's now going to be a next step that goes down to the state level. We have a committee here, and they have now posted the first bit of their own guidance about how to start at the state level. Comments are open until December 4, and I may ask if we can possibly put that up again at the end to remind people that the public is invited to comment. But it is public participation that helps to define the values and the goals that we want to emphasize, which leads then to the choice of which forms of priority emphasis will most likely achieve those goals that we can agree upon. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our next speaker. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Professor Charo. Next up tonight, we have Jonathan Temte, professor in the Department of Family Medicine and Community Health and the Associate Dean for Public Health and Community Engagement at the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine and Public Health. Temte has served as a clinician, teacher, and researcher for over 25 years. His research includes investigation on the relationships between communities, primary care, and respiratory viruses. An expert in vaccines and immunization policy, he is currently serving on the U.S. Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices as acting chair of its evidence-based recommendation work group. He's also the chair of the Wisconsin Council on Immunization Practices and serves as medical director for Public Health Madison and Dane County. He's also currently serving on the CDC Board of Scientific Counselors. Dr. Temte, thank you for joining us. Look forward to your perspectives.
Well, thank you so much, Mike, and to my colleagues for teeing up things wonderfully here. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk about now what? Now that we have vaccine candidates out there that are looking favorable, where do we go from here? So we're going to talk a little bit about authorization and what happens thereafter. Next slide. So a very quick review here. I want to talk about the vaccine approval process, build up on what Dr. Charo has said about allocation, mention a little bit about distribution, and then finish up talking about herd immunity issues and how that ties in with some of the things that Dr. Conway said about vaccine hesitancy. Next slide, please. So we have all heard of this magical term, the emergency use authorization. And this is very different than the usual licensure that the Food and Drug Administration uses for vaccines, which can be a timely process where they painstakingly go through information. Typically, when we look at licensure, we're looking at oftentimes a several month process. The emergency use authorization allows the FDA to facilitate availability of vaccines that are needed during a public health emergency. And by definition, we're in the middle of a public health emergency right now with this pandemic. But the one thing I want to emphasize is the FDA gives the full attention to the safety and efficacy. They are not cutting corners with this, but as Dr. Conway had mentioned, there have been a number of things through this warp speed authority to speed up the manufacture of vaccines prior to approval. And this can really shorten the time between development and the deployment. Next slide. So by historic precedent, almost all the recommendations for vaccines in the United States comes through the U.S. Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, which is housed at the CDC. The ACIP has the authority to make recommendations, and they also have the authority to require the federal government to pay for vaccines for children through the Vaccine for Children program. But the ACIP will create a recommendation, or shall we say a series of recommendations for this vaccine, and will detail the dosing, the intervals, precautions, contraindications, and most importantly, who should be receiving this vaccine and when. Next slide. So ACIP recommendations are based on many things. So first is the burden of disease, and then we have really important safety. We look at efficacy. We look at cost effectiveness. We look at feasibility. And an important concept is the values and preferences of vaccine recipients and vaccinators. And finally, after recommendation is made, it goes out to the stakeholders. We can just click one more. And then we really hope for this utilization widely. Next slide. So today, the ACIP met in Atlanta. Actually, they met virtually. This is a meeting that I used to go to, did so for 12 years, 3 to 4 times a year. But today they discussed two important things: the allocation of the initial supplies of COVID-19 vaccines in phase 1A, which is totally different than the phase 1, 2, and 3 that Dr. Conway talked about. But the phase 1A is this first little increment of vaccine being released. They looked at clinical considerations for the populations included, and then they talked about monitoring safety, very, very important things. And as of 4:45 this afternoon, Central Time, the ACIP voted to recommend a vaccine to 2 groups: healthcare personnel and residents of long-term care facilities. Next slide, please. This is depicted in this graphic from CDC showing phase 1A. Phase 2 is just out there for thinking. We haven't gotten to any decisions on that as of yet, but it's likely to involve the essential workers. And then phase 1C will be the adults with high-risk medical conditions and those over 65. Next slide. Keep in mind that this is going to be an ever-evolving situation. Phase 1 will emerge into phase 1A will emerge into phase 1B, into phase 1C, into phase 2, and so on. And hopefully by the time we get to March, April, and into the summer, we can get as many people vaccinated as we possibly can. Next slide. We've heard about Operation Warp Speed, and I'm just going to mention very quickly on deployment of vaccine. The manufacturers are already manufacturing hundreds of doses, or hundreds of thousands and millions of doses of vaccine to be available to send out as soon as there is authorization to do so. Along with that, there's a lot of attention to the kits. So you see in the center of this kitting facility, these are putting together the syringes, the gloves, the alcohol prep pads, bandages, and so on needed for providing vaccine. All this has to be coordinated and shipped out usually by public companies. They arrive at states, and the states will use various methods to get these vaccines into vaccine entities out there, people who are willing, organizations willing to take this on, and also have the requirements to have proper handling and storage of vaccines. Next slide. Now I'm going to finish up just talking very quickly on herd immunity. And this is a graphic that just came out about a month ago in JAMA, looking across the bottom of the basic reproductive number of viruses. And this concept is basically the number of new cases generated from each case. So at the very top end at 14.5 is our friend measles, the most contagious respiratory virus out there. And the black dot is SARS-CoV-2. And for each case, we generate about 2.5 new cases. But the bottom line is we can figure out how much of the population needs to be immune to stop a pandemic from continuing. And for SARS-CoV-2, it's essentially about 60%. So next slide. So keeping this in mind, let's say we need 60% of our population immune to stop this pandemic. How do we get there? Well, let's say we have 10% natural immunity from being infected and recovering. That leaves 50% of immunity that has to be given through vaccines. And the way we get to that is we have to look at how effective that vaccine is and how much utilization there is, or the coverage. So if we have a vaccine that is 90% effective, we're going to need vaccine coverage across the entire population of about 56%. Okay, next slide. So this is where it gets tricky. We are fortunate now with the 2 mRNA vaccines, the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine, to have incredible home runs in terms of effectiveness. These are 90 to 95% effective. But that still means that at the end of the day, we need to have 55 to 60% of our population immunized to make things go back to a more normal state. And that's a really, really high bar to get over. Next slide. So what we need for success, we need safe vaccines. We need effective vaccines. We need reasonable stepwise allocation plans out there. And that's the duty of the states to come up with. We need distribution systems, and we need this to be equitable across the board. And we need this willingness to be vaccinated, and we need good communication. And if it can hit the button. And with that, I'm going to stop and open things up for questions. Next slide. Okay.
Well, that was a great finish, seeing Bucky get vaccinated. Maybe they'll let him attend the games now that the rest of us can't go to. So question already coming in from the audience from Saul Sepsenwall. Will pharmaceutical companies with simpler storage logistics simply outcompete those like Pfizer?
Well, one of the things you have to recognize is that each of these markets, has capacity to deal with a number of different variables. Pfizer is a big company, but they're only on the hook for about 100 million doses to the United States market. They're on path to have about 1.3 billion doses available by the end of 2021. But they're already largely contracted to the EU, to the UK, to Japan. So, I'm serious when I say that we actually need multiple horses to win this race. That while their vaccine, may temporarily be more challenging to administer, it's still going to be the first one available, and we're going to be able to use it. I understand that they are going to work on a more temperature stable version eventually, and I think all of the companies are, as they get success, going to then continue to fine tune these to make them more available. But we need 8 billion people immunized to really get rid of this. So 16 billion doses, and it's going to take a team approach to really get there.
If I may add as well, in addition to those factors, as each vaccine finally comes online, I think we're likely to see some vaccines working better in certain subpopulations than others. So some may have side effects that are more easily tolerated by the elderly than others. Some may turn out to have better effect in the morbidly obese, whereas some may have a somewhat lowered level of efficacy there, of effectiveness there, as well as the fact that the first two coming online require 2 doses, which means they'll be much easier to manage if you're in a situation like a nursing home where people don't move, as opposed to the community where you have to worry about people coming back for their second dose. So it's not only the storage logistics, it's a whole variety of market variables that may make different vaccines answer different parts of that market.
And I'm going to just toss in real quick here too, that across the world, it's a luxury to have freezers that can be 94 degrees below zero. It's a luxury to even have freezers that will keep vaccines at regular freezer temperature. So across the world, we're really dependent on vaccines that are stable at moderately low temperatures to room temperature. We're going to be dependent on vaccines that can be 1 dose. And I'm talking about a wide swath of the world that is less privileged than we are in the United States. So this is going to be an important thing as we start looking across the world at equity.
Yeah, that certainly seems like it'll be a huge factor in which vaccines go where. So Brian Frona wonders about the relative efficacy of AstraZeneca's vaccine, which seems a bit lower than Pfizer and Moderna, but maybe relies, at least in part, on T-cell activation. Do you have any thoughts about comparisons across these vaccines?
Yeah, I mean, live viral vaccines typically have been associated with better T-cell responses than killed vaccines traditionally, and so that's been sort of one of the theories, and as people have developed different models of these vaccines. But the bottom line is time will tell. That all of these vaccines, we're going to need to continue to follow people in these studies to see how long the immunity lasts. They're going to continue to look at the type of immunity that they develop, and again, this is going to be a unfolding story about when are boosters needed, or are they even needed? And this is just going to be a story that we're all going to be writing and telling all at the same time together.
I think one thing to keep in mind is we never know how well a vaccine actually works and how long it works until it's out there and people are immunized. And there are many, many cases out there where we thought we had a great vaccine, only to discover that it lasted and gave protection for anywhere from 2 to 4 years when we were expecting a decade or longer. So those are things to keep in mind. Some vaccines, and I have to pick on the rubella vaccine, is one of our best vaccines, really, really highly efficacious, 1 dose, and it gives a lifetime of protection. So it's going to take months for us to try and figure out. So this first wave is just confronting, where we are right now. And a year from now, we're going to be a whole lot smarter than we are now.
Yeah, and Mike, one of the things that we should also mention is this is the norm for all vaccines. So that other phase of the studies that go on is called phase 4. And so after a vaccine is licensed, there is still a mandate that FDA sets that every company is required to continue to monitor. And so there are lots of vaccines that, 10 years, 15 years, like chickenpox vaccine, everybody got 1 dose. Then 10 years later, they're like, yeah, it'd probably be a good idea to get a booster dose. So I don't think people should consider this to be particularly unusual, that this is kind of how this is going to unfold. This is the continual accumulation of evidence and science that'll then allow for policy decisions and policy updates as we go through the next years.
And I've noticed in the chat that there's a question about how long-term side effects would be monitored, and it goes along with what Jim Conway was just saying. There's long-term monitoring for adverse events and side effects. There's a reporting system through the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, VAERS. And within the FDA, there's an office that is devoted entirely to receiving reports of adverse events and beginning to look for signals that suggest that there's a problem that hadn't been anticipated, and beginning to develop some method by which we can explore that possibility. In the most extreme circumstances, you'll find that a product may have to be pulled off the market entirely. More likely, it may be that we've identified a group of people that seem to have a bad reaction, so we can put a warning on there and tell doctors. But that's an ongoing process through the lifetime of that therapeutic intervention. It doesn't stop at the moment it's been approved.
Great. I'm glad you brought that up, Dr. Charo. One of the things, I think we should make clear is it's not the companies themselves who are responsible to report these incidents. That happens through the regulatory body and someone who doesn't have an economic interest in the outcome of that drug.
Right. The companies report what they know. The doctors report what they know. Patients, I once had to report something personally, but it's the agency that evaluates it with a more dispassionate eye.
Great. Question from Jess Starks. Where does the military fall in terms of this assessment of priority?
Well, a real quick answer here. The ACIP has the role of making recommendations for the U.S. civilian population. The military is entirely off the table there. They're making their own deals with the manufacturers, so we don't have a whole lot of information on that.
And of course, that's not a large population relative to the country as a whole. So, question from Danielle Camps. Can we be assured of positive efficacy from a small sample? What do we think about the sample sizes that were used? This was obviously an expedited process. I know other people wonder, is the FDA process expedited enough? Why can't they meet tomorrow instead of December 10th? But any thoughts about sample size concerns?
If I can jump in, the sample sizes for these vaccines are huge compared to most vaccines we deal with. So the Moderna had 30,000 people in it. The Pfizer, I believe, 44,000 people. And those are incredibly large sample sizes. I think they were that large to accelerate the rapidity at which you could get meaningful results. But I'm fairly comfortable with the data so far. And some of it has just been truly astounding. For example, in the Moderna trial, all of the severe cases of COVID-19 were in the placebo group. They had 0 in the vaccine recipients. And with both of them, the consistency between two trials using a similar platform, the mRNA vaccines, having this 90-95%, really makes me feel that there is a lot of robust information here. One of the problems, though, as you point out, is no vaccine trial is large enough to find every possible weird effect of a vaccine. No trial is large enough to be powered or to have enough of a sample size with various individuals in certain high-risk groups, people who have autoimmune disease, people with certain comorbidities, and so on. So these are things that we really have to look at carefully, not only during the trials, but in that post-licensure or the post-approval period.
And for what it's worth, there was a determined effort to make sure that the recruitment included people from various minority groups. In fact, at one point, Moderna actually had to slow down for a moment in its general recruitment to make sure that it received enough people from different ethnic backgrounds, different lifestyles, so that they would get results that were generalizable across as many people as possible. There were some of the trials actually had a fair number of people who were older, I'm not sure about elderly. Kids are a very special issue, though, because very young children are not going to metabolize things the same way as an adult. It's not as simple as just saying, if somebody's half the weight of an adult, you give them half the dose. And so often with children, you wait until the adult studies have been done, and then you adapt and have special trials focused on the young children separately.
Yeah, that's a really important point that Dr. Charo makes, is that people do need to recognize, while the attempts were to be as inclusive as possible with people that are suffering the worst effects of COVID-19, there were exclusions. The pregnant women were not included, and people with significant immunocompromising conditions were not included, and kids under the age of 17 were not included. So, these first recommendations are going to be in reaction to how the studies were designed, and only people that were included in those studies will then be in those recommendations as far as being recommended to be early recipients. All of the companies are committed that as they gather more safety data in larger and larger populations, that they will start doing studies in immunocompromised patients. Pfizer's gotten permission to now do 12 to 16-year-olds as the first company to work in the middle age group. And so this is a gradual process where they'll continue to add in other segments of the population so that eventually we will be able to provide vaccine for everybody. I mean, in many ways, it's going to kind of look like flu vaccines. There's probably going to be a whole bunch of them. They're all going to be a little bit different as far as who gets them. Right. And we're just going to have to figure out a system to monitor and manage that.
Well, this looks like a final exam question for the faculty, because it's from Hans Kuttner. What are the mechanisms by which federal priority orderings translate to what happens on the ground once the vaccines get out to the states and municipalities? How do we know those priorities are really upheld, I guess?
Well, the states in the end have the discretion to set their own priorities and to monitor them. So everything we've been talking about is advice to the states, but we've also heard from many officials in public health departments how very much they want this kind of guidance as they try to work at a much more granular level. Which counties, which facilities within each counties, how are they going to distribute? So the ACIP recommendations are crucial and incredibly influential, even if they are not determinative of what happens at each state.
I think that's a really good point. And the other thing I'll have to say is, for Dane County, I'm the person who has signed off on the vaccinator agreement for the public health department. And by signing off, I have guaranteed that I'm going to adhere to the recommendations of CDC and of the ACIP, whatever those may be. That being said, CDC and the ACIP are providing to the states flexibility and latitude as to how to best apply that vaccine to their population. So, for example, Dr. Charo has mentioned Wisconsin middle of the winter snowplow drivers are important people. That's a Wisconsin-Minnesota consideration, but it's not a Florida consideration. But I think it's really important to keep in mind that CDC and ACIP have been doing this for a very, very long time in terms of making recommendations. And they have been through one recent pandemic back in 2009. But the entirety of the recommendations are, I always look at that, borrowing a phrase from Pirates of the Caribbean, from the Pirates Code, it's more of a set of guidelines. And that's how I look at ACIP. They really put together a thoughtful evidence-based framework, but when the wheels really hit the road, it's going to be important to allow those vaccinators to make sure they can use it appropriate for their population and make sure that there are no wasted doses. This is going to be such an important vaccine to help bring us back to some level of normalcy that we just can't afford to be wasting doses. And if we have somebody there, they're not quite perfect, but we're at the end of the day, this vaccine is going to be wasted, we get it. And so this is going to be one of those important concepts out there.
Great, thank you. Another interesting question that maybe gets at the prisoner's dilemma aspect of this. Is it wise to wait a couple months to get the vaccine just to see if there are side effects? And I suppose if everybody thinks that way, we got a big problem on our hands, don't we?
Yeah, it doesn't seem like it's a particularly wise decision to forego getting the opportunity for protection, knowing what the safety trials have already shown. I mean, as Dr. Temte said, I mean, vaccines are always tested in a much more rigorous and broad way than drugs are. You know, drugs are 5 or 10,000 people, you give somebody a drug, it makes their condition better, you're willing to tolerate side effects. Vaccines are given to healthy people to keep them healthy, and so there's a lot less risk tolerance on the side effects. And so that's why 30, 40, 50,000 people are lined up, and that these monitoring processes are going to continue for years as these move forward. So I would think it would be foolhardy, if given the opportunity to get whatever vaccine is available, to forego it for a few more months. I mean, you got to remember, these studies started back in the midsummer, so many of them actually have 5-6 months of safety data now on some portion of their population. I'm absolutely comfortable that if you give me an opportunity right now, I'll get in the car and drive over right at 10 o'clock at night.
And I have to follow up on that and just say that there's a lot of concerns out there for long-term side effects, but in reality, most of the things that we're concerned about are going to be immune-mediated, and the standard is a total of 6 weeks or 42 days. And you get out of that window, and immune-mediated vaccine-induced side effects are very, very, very rare after that point in time. So again, as Joe has said, we've had tens of thousands of people now cross that 6-week mark, and without any significant safety signal to the point where it stopped either of these mRNA trials.
Does anyone have any sense how large the fraction of the population is in the US that has a negative attitude toward vaccines generally, what we might call the anti-vaxxers? And is that common in other countries as well?
The figure I saw today was about 12% were responding to a poll about why they wouldn't take the vaccine, saying that I just don't like vaccines, or I just don't trust vaccines. I wonder if that's a general figure or if that's just for COVID. That was a poll just on COVID.
Yeah, that's for general. For COVID, we're seeing numbers as high as 42% of people saying that, and in communities of color, we're seeing over 75% are saying that they will not accept during under an EUA authorization. But in general, I think it's variable around the country. You can see areas where it's as low as 2 or 3% of people are vaccine hesitant, but you can get into certain areas of the country where it can be as high as 20 or 30%. I think of Washington State is probably one of the more notorious areas, but there's lots of areas around the country where people do sort of cluster in like-minded areas, and so I think a range of 10 to 15% is sort of used as the general ballpark of people who at least have enough questions that they pause and may actually be hesitant depending on how the information is presented to them.
When you look at the tracking polls of people who say they don't trust the vaccine, it's actually changed over time. There was an increase in people saying that they didn't trust it as we saw it get more and more part of the political conversation in the run-up to the election. I think it's going to take a little while before we see some polls post-election to see whether or not we're beginning to see confidence rise again. We also see this interesting difference in confidence as between Republicans and Democrats, urban and rural. So we've got a lot of different groups that need to be each addressed with a different communication strategy in order to respond to their particular concerns.
One of the sort of positive intricacies of how the tiering works is that I do think that as health workers are the ones that are basically going to be receiving the vaccine initially, essentially on behalf of society, but also for our own benefit, I think that we're going to rapidly accumulate literally tens of millions of more recipients who are going to be, very willing to report any kind of side effects to add to the growing information. I think we'll have real fidelity in this information rather quickly certainly by the end of the first quarter of 2021.
Given the need for economic stimulus, should we not consider giving people a financial incentive to get vaccinated?
I'll leave that to the ethicists. I mean, it's a very fine line between incentivization and coercion. And I think people have always really struggled with what's the fine line between where it is given to sort of encourage versus actually buying people out. And we really have to be cautious about poverty being an incredible driver of decision-making that people have to deal with. And I would really hesitate to feel like we were buying off people who are in tougher straits. And I think that is a slippery slope that I would be hesitant to walk down.
And yeah, I doubt that the amount of money anybody's talking about would constitute what we typically call a Godfather offer, the offer that you can't refuse.
Right.
But you're right that anything that appears to be incentivizing poor people because they need the money so desperately is going to then generate a new level of skepticism. I do think rather than the government giving money, I anticipate what we're going to see is that some of the delivery sites, like some of the pharmacy chains, may very well decide that they'd like to encourage people who have a choice of venues to come to their place. So they'll give them a $5 or $10 coupon to be spent only at that store, right? A Walmart or a Target or whatever, in order to drive business to them for people that were already deciding to get the vaccine. That I think probably will happen because it'll be about business marketing more than about vaccine incentivizing.
Well, and there may be a different type of incentive too, because if things like airlines encourage people, or actually have special flights only for people that have been immunized, that's a different type of incentive. But I think there are creative ways we may see this just working to get the economy back that people may think of that are, smarter than me for certain.
And there's already, I'm sorry, I was
sorry.
going to say there's already conversations too about whether certain employment settings may lead some employers to say that you really do need to be vaccinated if you're going to have a lot of contact with people who may be vulnerable. Healthcare settings are one, but we may see it in other service settings with high customer contact, restaurants and such.
It's interesting along that line, bringing up the whole concept of mandates. Across the country, there is no such thing as a federal mandate for any vaccine. Mandates have always been on the purview of states or by organizations. So, for example, my employer requires me to have a flu shot every year, which is no big deal because I get one anyways. But when you're dealing with a new vaccine under emergency use authorization, it gets a little bit dicey initially whether or not one should or can actually mandate that. And I think we just have to give it some time. But as Jim was saying, I think there are a lot of these soft incentives. For example, the ability to travel more easily, the removal of fear from contagion that a lot of people have. I know a lot of colleagues who, at least for several months, would change in the garage before going into the house after
Right.
a day in the clinic. And
Yeah.
the vaccine, I have to admit that I was concerned that when vaccines came out, they were going to hit the FDA bar of 50% effective. And that's a coin toss for me. Getting the vaccine, yeah, it's better than nothing, but I don't feel highly protected with that. But now that we're looking at, 90, 95%, this is incredible. And when I see that they are not only effective for preventing COVID-19 disease, but they're highly effective in preventing severe disease. And when it comes down to it, I don't want to be hospitalized. I don't want to go to an ICU. I don't want to die. Would I be willing to have a minimal case? Yeah, it gets into this whole calculus out there. But we're even looking at 95% of people are not even having any symptoms. And that is where this vaccine or these two vaccines are incredible. They really, really have hit a very, very high bar. And when they hit that high bar with a level of safety that has been shown so far, I think we're really on an era of not only for these vaccines, but for the manufacture rapidly of new vaccines for the next pandemic. I hate to say that. But this really opens up an era of incredible technology.
Question from Matt Douglas, and maybe this is one we can end on since we're already over time, but this has been very interesting. How long do you think we'll have to continue social distancing? I guess, in other words, how long do you think it'll take till we hit that herd immunity point on the vaccination curve that you talked about earlier?
It'll take a while. And we have the knowns out there. We have a couple vaccines with high effectiveness. but we don't know how long they last. We don't know how long natural immunity lasts. So I think we're going to be looking at kind of our new status quo, at least through the springtime now. I'm noticing that with conferences that are being planned for next October, the conference planners are doing these virtually, at least ones that I'm familiar with. So I think we're in this for a number of months yet. But I'd be very interested in my colleagues' impressions on this.
Yeah, I have a slightly different take. I mean, I think that we may get back to something more closely resembling normal next summer, with a couple of things in our favor. You know, one is if both the mRNA vaccines reach the quantities that they say they may, and we get at least one or two of the other vaccines available, and we get a little bit more of a unified federal guidance and messaging about a lot of these mitigation procedures. I mean, I do think that this is actually, in many ways, a manageable situation that became unmanageable, but actually didn't need to be. And I do think that with a little bit more uniform approach and with consistent messaging, I mean, I do think there's a lot of people that need to be convinced, and I think they are right to be skeptical. I think that we've all gone through a lot of very challenging messaging over the last couple of years, and I think that there is an opportunity here. I think it's going to take a concerted collective effort for that messaging. But I think if enough people get vaccinated, I think summer may buy us some additional weather related benefit. And I think then it's going to hopefully be enough vaccine by fall that's available for the general public and around the world that I think we actually could, by next year's holidays, be a little bit more normal.
It does leave us, though, with a really tricky challenge, because between now and then, as we're growing the number of people who are vaccinated, we're going to see the weariness with taking precautions with social distancing and masking and hand washing begin to really show. And people are going to think, well, vaccines are out there. I don't need to do this anymore. It's going to get harder and harder to convince people to take basic public health protections. And that's going to be a simultaneous challenge along with communicating the value of the vaccine itself. So in many ways, the hard work has only just begun, but it's moved on to the people that deal with the squishy stuff like public communication.
Well, I think I see a light coming at the end of this tunnel. And thank you all for being here and sharing your knowledge and expertise with our audience tonight. What a fantastic panel and what a great time to do it. Really, thank you very much.
Very welcome.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you so much.
Great to have you with us. So thank you all for joining us. And remember, it is Giving Tuesday. If you're so moved, we could sure use your help at the university. There are many worthy causes, of course. Our students, first and foremost, academic excellence, UW Medicine, the research community. So anything you could do to help our world-class university would be greatly appreciated. UW Now will be back next week, Tuesday, December 8th. We hope you can join us then. And in the meantime, on Wisconsin.